You arrived early. Too early, if you're being honest. You thought you were being cautious, responsible, the kind of person who never misses a flight and always has a charger tucked in their bag. But now, hours later, sitting in a seat that barely reclines beneath lighting too soft to be comforting and too bright to be romantic, you wonder if maybe you were running. Not from something dramatic, just from the heaviness of an apartment that had grown too quiet. A routine that had frayed at the edges, a version of yourself you weren't sure still fit. You came here to catch a plane. What you caught instead was stillness. At first, the airport was just noise. Rolling suitcases, muttered announcements, overpriced coffee, and that endless looping music that plays in places where time isn't real. You made your way through security like muscle memory, slipped your shoes back on, smiled at no one. It all felt like choreography, something your body knew how to do, even when your mind didn't want to dance. And then the delay happened. You didn't hear it at first. You were scrolling, pretending to read something profound, but mostly looking at photos you'd already seen. The announcement was muffled, the words blurred by static and half-interest. But then people around you started shifting. One woman sighed dramatically. A man cursed under his breath. You caught the words storm and until further notice, and suddenly your escape route vanished. The flight was postponed. 3, maybe 4 hours. Maybe more. You should have been annoyed. You should have rolled your eyes and started calculating what time you'd actually get in, whether your hotel would still hold the room. But you didn't. Instead, you just exhaled, long and slow, and leaned back in the uncomfortable lounge. Seat like someone who had nothing else left to chase. A strange relief passed over you. Like something had stepped in and told you, you don't have to move forward yet. Just stay, just be still. So you did. You found a better corner. A quieter seat near the far end of the lounge, close enough to the windows to see the rain smear the tarmac like brushstrokes, but far enough from the TV screens and the restless business travelers calling someone named Carol for the 5th time. You plugged in your phone, took off your jacket, sipped water, watched your reflection in the glass as planes sat idle like sleeping animals too tired to fly. You weren't going anywhere, and for once that didn't feel like punishment. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to lose track of what hour it was. You let your head rest back, let the buzz of voices blur into one long hush. And that's when he sat down. You didn't see him approach. You only noticed him when the air shifted slightly beside you, when the edge of the seat dipped gently, and someone cleared their throat with the politeness of a person who didn't want to intrude, but had nowhere else to go. You turned your head just slightly. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but something deeper. The kind of tired that settles in the eyes, softens the jaw, makes a person look like they've been holding something heavy for a while. He wore a gray t-shirt and a thin navy jacket that looked like it had weathered one too many early morning flights. He had headphones slung around his neck, a worn leather bag at his feet, and a paperback book that had been folded in half too. Many times he smiled when you glanced over, not big, not flirtatious, just a quick, genuine flicker of human connection, like he was saying, I see you here. Isn't this all strange? You gave a polite smile back, then returned your gaze to the window, but something in you had already shifted. You're not sure what it was. Maybe the way he didn't immediately pull out his phone. Maybe the way he adjusted his seat slightly away from yours, as if giving you space mattered. Maybe it was just the quiet. The shared understanding that neither of you had planned to be here this long. That this wasn't the beginning of anything. But maybe it could be the middle of something soft. Minutes passed, then his voice. Gentle, low, almost amused. Any idea when they're letting us go? You shook your head. Not for hours, apparently. He chuckled. Figures. I was supposed to be somewhere by midnight. Looks like I'll be lucky to get there by morning. You smiled. At least we've got excellent carpet and lukewarm tea. He grinned. It lit up his face in a way that made you realize he wasn't just attractive. He was warm, safe in the way thunderstorms are when you're inside and dry and watching them from behind glass. That's true, he said. And strangers to share it with, it wasn't a pickup line. You would have felt it if it was. It was something else. A shared breath. A mutual shrug at the ridiculousness of time and plans and the way the world never really listens. The conversation trickled and slowly, like rain gathering at the edge of a window pane. You learned his name, his flight destination, a little about his job, not too much. Just enough to feel like you weren't alone in this pause. He didn't ask anything invasive, didn't lean in too far. He laughed easily, and when he sipped his tea, he grimaced like it was a betrayal, and you both laughed. You told him a little about your own delay, what you were flying toward, what you were flying from. You left out the deeper parts, the reasons that made you arrive too early in the first place. But even so, you felt yourself unfolding. There's something about airports, isn't there? They feel like confessional booths in motion. No past, no future, just the now. Everyone between things. Everyone slightly softer. You found yourself saying things you wouldn't normally say. That you felt tired all the time lately. That you kept thinking of starting over, though you didn't know what starting meant anymore. That maybe, just maybe, you were hoping for something unexpected. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened, really listened. His eyes stayed on yours, not demanding, not pressing. Just their dot the minutes dissolved. So did the discomfort. So did the awareness that you were strangers. You weren't anymore. Not quite dot, and then it hit you how strange it was that this all began with a delay. That if the storm hadn't rolled in, if the gate hadn't changed, if time hadn't decided to stretch out and make room, you'd never be sitting beside someone who felt like stillness instead of distraction. You didn't plan to meet him. You just stayed long enough to be found. There was a certain comfort in the way he sat close but not crowding. A measured nearness, not accidental, not intentional, just present, like he wasn't there to change the direction of your day, but only to share a corner of it. For a long while, he didn't speak, and neither did you. The quiet between you was tender in a way most silences aren't. There was no push to fill it, no need to explain yourselves. The delay hung in the background, a quiet backdrop to the stillness the two of you were allowing to form in the moment. And you remember thinking he could have sat anywhere. There were plenty of empty chairs, but he sat one seat too close. And somehow it didn't feel like a mistake. He didn't reach for his phone the way most people would. He didn't tuck his head into a screen or bury himself in music. He just sat there as if he'd already realized something you were only just starting to feel, that whatever this was, it didn't need distraction. He was a man with tired eyes, but not the kind of tired that made you nervous. His tiredness felt like something you recognized, the kind that comes from caring too much and telling too little. He looked like someone who'd been many places and learned to let silence settle in like a friend rather than something to fix. It was only after the fourth announcement, another delay. More waiting, the familiar drone of airport helplessness, that he turned to you again. His voice, when it came, was soft enough to surprise you. Is it weird that I kind of like this? You turned your head, catching his half smile. What, the delay? Yeah, he said, eyes scanning the view beyond the windows. Feels like I'm finally allowed to stop moving. You considered that. Maybe we need things like this. Time we can't explain away with schedules. He nodded. Time we don't have to earn. It wasn't profound, and yet it was. Because you felt it too. That strange kind of peace that comes when the world forces you to pause. When the next thing is just far enough away that you don't have to hold your breath for it anymore. You settled into the space beside him a little deeper, not in body, but in ease. Your shoulders dropped a little. Your eyes wandered less. His presence didn't demand anything, but it offered something. Stillness, safety, a kind of unexpected companionship. After a few more minutes, he leaned forward slightly and said, I'm James, by the way. You smiled. Of course you are, he laughed. And you? You hesitated for just a breath, not because you didn't want to tell him, but because saying your name out loud made it real somehow. It gave the moment weight. But you told him anyway, and the way he said it back made it sound softer, lighter, like something he already liked saying. Names exchanged, it suddenly became easier to talk. Not in a flood, not in a tumble, but in small threads, like stringing pearls one at a time. He told you about where he was going, Denver for work, maybe for something more. He didn't elaborate, you didn't press. You told him about your destination, the reason you booked the flight, the thing you thought you were supposed to run toward. Neither of you said much about the past. But somehow the now began to stretch, to fill in the spaces between words like warm air rising. He asked if you wanted anything from the bar, and you said sure, even though you weren't particularly thirsty. When he returned, 2 drinks in hand, you noticed he hadn't picked the safest choice. Not a soda or water, something amber and a little smoky. You took a sip, and it burned just slightly, enough to feel like you were somewhere else. Sorry, he said, watching your reaction. I went with my favorite. Too strong. You shook your head. No, just unexpected. Seems like that's the theme of the evening. You both smiled at that dot the lights above you dimmed slightly as the hour passed. The rain outside had grown heavier, but no one inside seemed to mind anymore. It was late enough that most of the lounge had settled into quiet murmurs and curled up. Coats. You sat side by side like travelers in a waiting room between lifetimes. He shifted closer. Just an inch. Just enough that your arms were almost touching now. And when he laughed at something you said, a joke about the irony of airports selling luggage, his shoulder brushed yours. You didn't move away. Instead, you let your body absorb the moment. The warmth, the weight, the strange comfort of a man you just met whose nearness didn't feel like a trespass, but an offering. You learned small things next. His favorite album, the last place he got lost in, the thing he kept meaning to write but never had time for. You told him a little about your own should-haves, about the notebook in your bag you never quite fill. He didn't try to impress you. He didn't shift into performance. He just existed there beside you like someone who knew how to leave space and share it all at once. It was around this time that you caught yourself watching his hands, the way they moved when he talked, the way his fingers wrapped around the glass like he meant to remember its shape. They were not soft hands, not rough either, just honest. Hands that looked like they'd held more than they'd said. You wondered quietly what they might feel like on your cheek. You didn't say it, but your body knew. Eventually, he leaned in and said something that made you laugh louder than you meant to. Heads turned briefly in your direction, but neither of you cared. You pressed your palm over your mouth to quiet yourself, and when you looked at him again, his eyes were already on you. And this time, the silence that followed wasn't just soft. It was charged. He looked at you like someone who didn't need to touch you to know what it would feel like. Like someone who already knew how the night would move if you let it. Not rushed, not planned. Just inevitable, and yet he didn't push forward. He waited, as if saying, if you stay here, it's because you want to. You glanced at the board again. The gate hadn't changed. The delay remained, but something in you had moved. You could have stood up, said you needed air, gone to the bathroom, pretended to check your phone. But you didn't. Instead, you shifted slightly toward him. Not a lot. Just enough, and that was the moment. Not when the kiss would come that hadn't arrived yet, but the moment before. The decision without words. The mutual nod of two people sitting one seat too close, who no longer wanted the space between them. The air changed, the light changed, but neither of you said a word. You just stayed, because somehow you knew the delay wasn't a mistake, Dot. It was permission, Dot. It's strange. The things you remember from that night. Not the exact phrases, not the full sentences, but the rhythm of the way he spoke, the softness of the air between you, the flicker of overhead lights that dimmed as the lounge began to empty of urgency. You remember the way his voice rose just slightly when he was making a point, and then how it would fall again, gentle as if he didn't want to disturb the hush you had both somehow agreed to protect. The room had people in it still. Laptops open, boarding passes held loosely, a few families sleeping in clusters on couches. But they faded like the sound of traffic when you're far enough inside your own moment. It became just the two of you, and the delay, and the strange feeling that no one was really waiting for you anymore. You talked like time had forgotten about you, like the world had gone quiet on purpose so that you could speak freely, not just to each other, but to yourselves through each other. You didn't start with the heavy things. That would come later. Instead, you lingered in the in-between. Favorite books, songs that got you through long drives, foods you swore by in heartbreak, the odd little rituals you each kept. He drank tea in the shower. You wrote lists you never intended to finish. These were the kinds of things you'd normally share only with someone who'd already proven they were staying. But something about the airport made everything feel temporary enough to be safe. He had a way of listening that was rare. Not just hearing the words, but holding them. Like your stories weren't strange or silly or tired, but new again, just because he hadn't heard them yet. He asked you questions that didn't dig too deep, but opened something anyway. Where do you go in your head when you're too tired to be yourself? He asked after you'd mentioned a dream you had when you were 13. You blinked at the question, thought about it, and then answered without hesitation. He smiled at your reply, and you liked that he didn't nod too quickly. He let the answer sit. You asked him what made him feel most like himself. He paused. You could see him sift through a dozen answers before landing on something quiet. When I'm alone in a hotel room after midnight, he said, and I realized no one knows where I am. It wasn't a sad answer, just honest. It made you want to sit beside him in every hotel room after midnight and prove that being known didn't have to mean being watched. The drinks had gone warm by then. You weren't drinking them anymore, just holding the glasses like anchors to keep your hands from reaching too soon. The distance between your knees had vanished. You hadn't noticed. Neither had he. The intimacy hadn't rushed in. It had crept, like light pooling in a corner. It just happened. And when it did, it didn't scare you. The airport lounge became something else entirely. It wasn't a place of transit anymore. It wasn't the stretch of time before a gate opened. It became a pause stretched so long it became its own destination. The music overhead faded into nothing, or maybe you just stopped noticing it. What you heard instead was the sound of your voice when you weren't trying to impress anyone. What you heard was the way he repeated back the last few words you'd said, not to mimic you, but to make sure you felt heard. At one point, he asked, "What's the one thing you've never told anyone out loud?" And the air between you dropped, in temperature just enough for you to feel it in your ribs. You didn't laugh it off. You didn't turn the question around. You thought about it, really thought, and then you said something. Not the biggest secret you carried, but a real one. A true one. Something you hadn't spoken into the air before. When it left your lips, you half expected regret to follow. But it didn't. What came instead was stillness. He didn't flinch. He didn't fix. He just said, "Yeah, I get that." And you believed him. He told you something then too. Not an exchange, just because the quiet made it feel right. He told you about the time he almost moved to a city he didn't love for someone he thought he might, and how afterward he started keeping a suitcase half packed, not out of preparation, but out of fear that staying somewhere too long would make him soft again. You didn't say anything, just looked at him, and that look was enough. You didn't need to tell him that you, too, sometimes slept better in places you didn't belong. Somewhere in the distance, another delay was announced, a different gate, a different flight, but it didn't matter. You were floating inside a space that didn't operate by the airport's schedule anymore. You were no longer waiting. You were inside something. A moment that neither of you had planned for, but one that neither of you wanted to break. There's a particular magic that happens when two people know they will not become each other's future and still choose to be entirely present. No performance, no pretending. Just the soft unfolding of two spirits touching without fear of consequence. That's what it felt like. Like you weren't falling in love, but like maybe you had just discovered a version of yourself that you hadn't felt in a long time, and he had something to do with that. The airport had grown quieter. The crowd thinned. The night deepened. You were leaning closer now, both of you. Not enough to call it intimacy, but enough to call it agreement. You would not name this thing, but you would not deny it either. Your elbow rested close to his. His voice dropped lower. You spoke more slowly. You let pauses bloom fully before speaking again. The kinds of pauses that said, "I could sit like this with you for hours and not need to fill a thing." When your eyes met again, something changed. Not in the atmosphere, but in the breath between your mouths. There was something unfinished lingering there. Not tension, just curiosity. The kind that asks gently rather than demands. He didn't kiss you then. He just looked at you, and you looked back. And that was enough for now, because talking to him felt like flying without leaving the ground. And for the first time in a long time, you weren't trying to land. You just wanted to stay in the sky a little longer. It began so quietly, you almost didn't notice it. Just a flicker in the air, a note you hadn't heard in years slipping beneath the murmur of other voices, the shuffle of feet, The low mechanical hum of flight announcements you were no longer listening to. You were mid-sentence when it happened, telling him about a summer spent near the coast, about how you'd slept with the windows open and counted fireflies through sheer curtains that fluttered like slow-breathing lungs. But then a melody curled around the room like steam rising off. A cup of tea and your voice caught. You didn't say anything at first. You just paused, tilted your head slightly, let the notes wind their way into the space between you. It wasn't a loud song. Nothing dramatic. Just soft piano keys, the quiet tap of a snare, and then a voice familiar and far away all at once. It was a song you hadn't heard in maybe 10 years, maybe more. A song that used to make you feel older than you were. A song you used to press your heart against when no one else was listening. And now here it was, playing in an airport lounge, during a delay that had stretched far past reason, threading itself through the moment like it belonged. You didn't say the name of the song. You didn't need to, but he noticed your silence. You know it? He asked softly, watching your face instead of the ceiling speakers. You nodded. I used to fall asleep to it. He didn't reply right away, just smiled in that small understanding. The way he did, like he wasn't trying to push, but wanted you to know he saw it. The shift in your breath, the tiny fracture in your voice. It's the kind of song, you said after a moment, that used to mean everything, even though I didn't know what it meant. He leaned his elbow on the armrest, turning more toward you now. I think that's what the best ones do. They hold you before you understand what you're aching for. The lyrics settled into the room like they'd always belonged there. Something about waiting. Something about knowing when to leave. Something about hands not quite touching, but remembering how. You didn't need to sing along. The words lived somewhere just beneath your skin, and as you sat beside him in the dim golden hush of the lounge, you remembered what it was like to be young and lonely and convinced music was your only way of being held. He asked you what it reminded you of, and you surprised yourself by answering truthfully. You told him about a boy who never loved you back, and how you used to lie on your bedroom floor with the song playing on repeat, pretending you didn't want more than what was never offered. You told him about the kind of silence that fills you and the world doesn't explain why you feel so much. You told him how you used to mouth the lyrics at your reflection, hoping it might somehow understand you better than you did yourself. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He just nodded, slow and sure, and said, we all have one of those songs, the ones that carry our ghosts. That's when you realize something, not just about the song, but about the man beside you. He wasn't trying to make you forget. He was letting you remember. He wasn't smoothing over your pain or romanticizing it into something else. He was simply holding it with you, like someone who knew how to keep company with sadness without making it the whole story. And just like that, the conversation changed, not in tone, but in depth. He began to tell you about the year he lost his father, about the way he stopped listening to music entirely for a while, afraid of what might come up if he let melody into his grief. He said the silence had been loud back then. He said it made him understand the difference between loneliness and solitude, and you, sitting there with your hands in your lap and your body leaning closer by degrees you barely noticed, felt something shift in your chest. Not longing, not desire, something quieter, like being seen in a way that didn't make you self-conscious, like finding out that your worst parts weren't actually that strange, and maybe, just maybe, someone else had sat with them before too. The song faded, replaced by something more upbeat, something forgettable. But it didn't matter. It had already done its work. It had opened a door. You and he walked through it slowly, side by side. The stories that followed weren't loud. They weren't neat. You talked about disappointment, about things you'd left behind that still whispered to you sometimes when you were brushing your teeth or standing in line at the grocery store. You talked about the comfort of strangers, how sometimes telling the truth was easier when the person in front of you didn't have a place in your life to rearrange. You talked like the flight would never leave. You talked like the world had made space just for this dot. At one point, you told him you were scared to want anything too much. That every time you started to care, you began counting the days before it would leave. You said it with a laugh, trying to soften the blow of your own honesty, but he didn't laugh back. He just said, "That sounds exhausting." And for the first time it did, hearing it said aloud, feeling it reflected. He didn't promise anything, didn't tell you that you wouldn't feel that way again, but he placed a hand just gently on the table between you, not reaching, not asking, just making it known. "I'm here." You didn't touch it, not yet, but your eyes did. They rested there for a long time. And that was enough. Time blurred after that. You stopped checking the board, stopped watching the minutes. The airport had become irrelevant. You were no longer waiting for a flight. You were suspended inside something else entirely, something too soft to name and too big to fit inside. A sentence. There's a kind of romance that doesn't ask for a future. A kind that lives entirely in the present, feeding only on attention and quiet, and two people willing to sit beside each other without armor. That's what this was becoming, not a beginning, not a promise. Just the deep exhale of two people who had nothing left to prove. And the song. You don't even remember when it ended, only that when it did, the air still felt full because he was still there, and so were you. You never planned to say it. Not in a place like this, not to a stranger who knew your name only because you'd murmured it between boarding delays and a sip of too warm whiskey. You've always carried that truth the way people carry breakables, carefully, close to the chest, padded with polite laughter and reworded stories that make everything sound manageable. But now, sitting beside him in the echoing half-light of the lounge, with your coat draped over your lap and his eyes steady on yours, you feel it begin to stir. Like it has grown impatient inside you. Like it wants to be seen, finally. There's no drama to it, no moment of thunder, just a quiet breath you don't realize you've held for too long. He hasn't asked you anything, not in the direct way, but something about the rhythm of his presence, the soft cadence of his voice, and the respectful stillness in the way he listens has been loosening knots in you all evening. You've already given him pieces, small confessions disguised as anecdotes, fleeting glances at parts of yourself that you rarely offer in daylight. But this one thing you've never handed it to anyone. Not like this. Not raw dot, and now you find yourself thinking, if I don't speak it now, it might never let me breathe again. He's tracing the rim of his glass with one finger, not looking at you too directly, and it feels safer that way. He knows you're close to a cliff edge, and he's not going to push or pull, just stay close enough that if you fall, he'll still be there. I used to lie about who I was, you say quietly, not to deceive anyone, but just to be likable, to be easy to love. The words feel like small stones dropping into a still lake. No splash, just ripples. He looks up then, not surprised, not judging, just present. You keep going, voice low but steady, like the words are forming themselves for the first time. I spent years trying to become the kind of person I thought people wanted. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I apologized for being too much, too quiet, too complicated. I swallowed things I should have screamed. You look down at your hands. They're clenched in your lap. You hadn't noticed. You open them slowly, as if releasing something fragile. I used to think if I made myself small enough, someone would finally choose me. The silence afterward is full, not empty, not awkward. Just a stillness that understands. You expect him to speak, to offer comfort or insight, but he doesn't, not immediately. He just lets the words rest in the space between you like something sacred, and in that pause, you feel something loosen in your chest. A not UNTYNG dot finally, he speaks softly. Thank you for telling me that. Not I'm sorry. Not me too. Not why. Just thank you. And somehow that feels like the safest reply in the world. You look up, and his eyes are steady on yours. There's no pity there, no fix-it energy, just a gentle presence. And it makes you want to say more dot, so you do. You tell him about the first time you realized someone's love came with conditions, about the way you tried to mold yourself into shapes that didn't fit, about the exhaustion of always being pleasant. You tell him how, even now, you still catch yourself shrinking in rooms, how you sometimes leave parties early and then cry. In the car, because you don't know what you're mourning at, he listens the whole time. Not interrupting, not performing empathy, just being there, his silence like a soft hand resting near yours, not touching, just close enough to feel dot when you stop talking. It isn't because you've run out of things to say. It's because the quiet has arrived again, the kind that feels like rest. He sits with you in it, and then he says, it's brave to speak something that doesn't need fixing. That line stays with you longer than any compliment you've ever received because it doesn't frame your pain as a puzzle. It doesn't see your vulnerability as an invitation to save. It just sees you as you are, messy, whole, enough. Find yourself smiling, not because anything is funny, but because your body is starting to believe what your heart has been whispering all night. You're allowed to exist without apology. He reaches out then, slowly, palms up, open between you. An invitation. You don't take his hand, but you place yours near it. And for now, that's enough. That gesture, simple, quiet, unassuming, feels more intimate than a kiss. It says, I'm here with you. I'm not going anywhere. Not until you're ready. You both sit like that for a long while. In the corner of your mind, you hear another flight announcement, but it feels like it's happening in another country, another life. This lounge has become its own kind of world, a world where time isn't tracked in minutes, but in breath and pause and truth. You think about how rare it is to meet someone like this. Someone who doesn't demand your past be wrapped in a bow, who doesn't need a story with a happy ending to stay interested. Someone who understands that sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is not run away when the truth is ugly and soft at the same time. You glance over at him. He's watching you the way people watch sunsets, not to capture, not to rush, just to witness. And in that moment, you think this is what it means to be held without hands. It was just one drink. The kind people order when they want to fill their hands with something that gives the illusion of control. You didn't need it, not really. But when he asked if you'd like another, you said yes, not for the drink itself, but for the few extra minutes it promised. A soft continuation of the moment, an excuse to stay close, to not pull away. The glass felt cool in your hand when he returned, and for a moment you traced your finger around its rim, more focused on the weight of his presence than whatever was in it. He'd started telling a story by then, something light, almost ridiculous, about a wrong train, a missed meeting, a girl in a sunflower dress who gave him the wrong directions but left him with a poem anyway. It wasn't the story that mattered. It was the way he told it. His voice moved like music, not showy, not loud, but rhythmically sure. It pulled you in. Not with grand declarations or dramatic pauses, but with the steady, undeniable comfort of someone who knows how to hold attention without demanding it. Every now and then he'd glance your way to see if you were still following. You always were. You sipped the drink slowly, not to pace yourself, but because everything about this moment asked to be prolonged. His laugh low, slightly hoarse, shaped by memory. The way his eyes crinkled at the edges when he smiled, like he didn't just use his mouth to express things, but his whole face. And the way his body was shifting without even realizing it, inch by inch toward yours, like gravity had a hand. In it now, he leaned in, not aggressively, not with purpose, but with comfort. Like his body had grown familiar with yours in the past few hours. like the space between your chairs had forgotten it once belonged to anyone else. Your knees brushed, then settled there, neither of you pulling back. His arm rested on the armrest beside yours, close enough that the warmth radiated even without contact. And every time he moved slightly, you could smell the faint cedar of his cologne, subtle and human and utterly distracting. You asked him something then, something offhand about where he would be if not for this flight. And he answered honestly, not with rehearsed plans or a tidy itinerary, but with a shrug and a soft confession, probably nowhere important. I think sometimes I make myself busier than I need to be just to avoid sitting still. That made you smile. And now the airport made you do it anyway. Yeah, he said, his voice dipping just a bit. And it turns out this is the first time in weeks I felt like I wasn't chasing something. You looked at him, really looked, at the way he carried tiredness behind his eyes like a passenger he hadn't quite dropped off. At the tiny scar above his eyebrow, like a story he never tells unless someone asks the right way. At the soft curl of his fingers, just relaxed enough now to betray how safe he felt sitting next to you. And you realized then that he wasn't leaning in because of romance. He was leaning in because you were the quietest place he'd been in a long time. Still, it was romantic. Not the kind that screams or burns or demands, but the kind that warms from the inside. Like tea sipped slowly in silence. Like a sweater you forgot you loved until you found it again on a rainy day. You leaned back just slightly and let your shoulder brush his. Just once, just long enough to say, I'm here too. He paused, looked down at your shoulder against his, then looked at you. No words, but everything was said in the breath you both shared. The conversation carried on, lighter again, the way moments do when two people start to orbit each other without needing permission. You asked him about childhood things, the first lie he ever told, the name of a pet he still dreams about sometimes. He asked you what your name meant and you told him, even though you rarely do. You liked how he said it, how it rolled off his tongue without being rushed. Like it mattered to him. At some point, you both laughed too loud at something, what it was, you can't even remember. But the people nearby glanced over and smiled, not annoyed, but soft by it, as if the sound of your laughter had reminded them of something they missed. You didn't care who was listening. You were leaning closer now too, matching him without thought. When he moved his hand to rest lightly on his knee, your hand hovered near it, not touching, not needing to. The space between your fingers hummed like something electric. The drink in your glass was nearly gone, but you didn't notice. What you noticed was how his eyes kept dipping down to your mouth when you spoke. Not every time, but enough. You noticed how his knee had pressed gently into yours now, not shifting back. And how, when you said something soft, something about the way you always feel like a different person when you travel, he didn't answer right away. He just exhaled and said, I get that. And you knew he did. The leaning in became something else then, not accidental, not quite intentional, just inevitable. Your voices were softer, your heads tilted toward each other without needing direction. The room grew dimmer, or maybe the moment just became brighter, and everything else faded into blur. And still, you didn't kiss Dot, not yet. Instead, he asked if you'd ever wish time would slow down just for a night. You said yes, without even thinking. And the way he looked at you then made the room disappear entirely. There are moments that don't need climax to be unforgettable. There are nights when closeness itself is the story. The brushing of shoulders, the shared glass of something forgotten, the quiet way two people lean in like they've been doing it all their lives without knowing it. You stayed like that, not speaking, not needing to. Two bodies tilted toward each other like flowers to warmth Dot, and in your mind you knew this was the middle of something, maybe not forever, but certainly not nothing. You didn't mean to go there. It started the way these things always do. Harmless curiosity, a playful question tossed into the soft hush between you. You didn't know the words would hang differently in the air this time, like they were waving. To open a door you'd both been pretending wasn't there. You'd been safe until now, dancing around heat, not stepping into it. But when you let the conversation drift, just slightly, just enough, you felt something shift. A tilt in the room, a deepening of breath, like the night itself had turned to look at you. You asked him, what's something you never say out loud because you're afraid it might come true? And when the words left your mouth, you realized you weren't sure whether you were asking him or yourself. He leaned back a little in his chair, as if the weight of it needed space, ran a hand through his hair, eyes still fixed on you. Then, in a voice lower than before, more thoughtful, he said, that sometimes I think I'm better at being close to people I'll never see again. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an offering of truth. And you took it gently, cradling it in your silence, because you knew exactly what he meant. That closeness feels safest when there's no future hanging over it like a question. That letting someone in doesn't. Feels so risky when goodbye is built in. You nodded once, just enough to let him know he hadn't said too much, and that was the beginning of it. The conversation stretched, grew darker around the edges. He asked you, have you ever wanted someone you couldn't explain? And the moment he said it, his gaze dropped slowly to your lips, just for a breath before returning to your eyes. Your body responded before your mind could catch up. You shifted in your seat, felt heat crawl up your neck, felt your fingers curl slightly on your lap like they needed something to hold on to. The air between you grew thick then, not with awkwardness, but with a question that hadn't yet formed into words. A wondering, you said, I think we all do. We want people who remind us of something we forgot we needed. He tilted his head. And what do I remind you of? It was the most dangerous thing he could have asked, not because it was forward, but because it was true, because somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice was already answering him before you decided if you were ready to hear it. You tried to keep your tone light, but it came out softer than you meant. You remind me of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. He exhaled, almost like a laugh, but not quite. Like something inside him had relaxed at your honesty. That might be the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me. And then, for a few long seconds, neither of you spoke because it was already happening. The conversation had become a current, and you were both in it. No swimming backward now. No retreat. He asked if you believed people could have chemistry without knowing anything about each other's lives. And you said yes, because you did. Because what you felt right now had nothing to do with birthdays or last names or whether you'd ever stand in the same city again. It was something primal, immediate, not lust, not just that, but an ache to be near, to be known without the weight of history, to be touched without being rewritten. He leaned in again, just a little closer, and this time, the space between you buzzed like a wire about to snap. You told him, sometimes I think the kind of connection that matters isn't the one that lasts, it's the one that wakes you up. He nodded slowly. Then this feels like waking up. His voice had dropped again. And so had yours, Dot, and now your knees were touching again, more fully this time. And your hands, once safely distant, were resting beside each other on the narrow armrest between you, your pinkies just barely grazing. You didn't move away. You didn't need to. The danger now was not in the NEA or NE's S dot. It was in how much you wanted to close the distance completely. He looked at your mouth again, slower this time, as if memorizing it, as if unsure whether to kiss you or wait for you to do it first. And you let him look because you wanted it too, but instead of reaching for you, he asked another question. Would you tell me to stop if I leaned in? You didn't answer with words. You tilted your head just slightly toward him. The smallest yes, and yet still he didn't move. The restraint was unbearable. And beautiful Dot, it made you want him more because he wasn't rushing. He wasn't claiming. He was honoring something. Waiting for the moment to be something you both stepped into at the same time. You whispered then, why haven't you? He smiled, not smug, not coy, just soft. Because I wanted the moment before the kiss to last a little longer. And that those words made your breath catch. You had spent so many years trying to skip ahead, rushing to the end, chasing certainty, hurrying into affection like it was a bus you had to catch or be left behind. But this man, this stranger, was teaching you how to savor the pause, how to live inside the before Dot, so you leaned in just slightly more, close enough to feel the warmth of his breath, close enough to blur the edges Dot and still no kiss Dot, just eyes, just silence, just the electric, unbearable beauty of two people holding a moment still between them. This was the danger you hadn't prepared for. Not the risk of touching, but the risk of meaning it. And how much you meant it, Dot, happened softly, as most real things do. His hand was already close, had been close for what felt like hours now, resting just beside yours on the armrest. You both pretended to ignore, and your hand, half curled, was warm from the drink you were no longer drinking, your fingers loose but alert. You weren't waiting for it exactly, but you were aware of him, of the weight of the moment, of the breath you hadn't yet taken, suspended in something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite longing, but a curious and lovely in between. And then, just like that, it happened. His hand shifted, the way hands do when nerves are trying to become bold. It wasn't a grab, not even a reach, just the back of his fingers brushing the edge of yours, as if asking a question without a single word. The touch was light, like a leaf landing on water, a gesture so soft you almost could have missed it, but you didn't, because your whole body noticed. Every cell, every inch of skin, every closed door inside you that had started, without permission, to open. You didn't pull away, not because you were trying to be brave, not because the story needed it, but because in that moment, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like permission had already bloomed inside you slowly over the course of everything that came before. The stories, the glances, the leaning, the laughter you still felt in your bones, and now the touch. Not the kind that demands, but the kind that asks. The kind that lets you say yes without saying anything at all. You turned your hand slightly, just enough so that your fingers found his, lightly, quietly, as if testing whether this was real or still part of the soft ache of wishing. His breath caught. You felt it before you heard it. He didn't speak, neither did you, because nothing needed saying. You just sat like that, hands barely touching, hearts wide open in a space that had once been just a place to wait for a plane, and now had become the most honest place you've been in months. It's strange how quickly the body learns new languages. The language of stillness, of touch, of gentle declarations that don't need to be translated. You felt the way his thumb shifted slightly, brushing your knuckle. You noticed the exact warmth of his palm, the way his fingers curled, not to hold you tightly, but to let you know he could, if you wanted him to. You didn't look at him right away. You couldn't. Your eyes were fixed on the place where your hands now rested, overlapping like a quiet agreement. Something about it felt holy, not religious, but sacred. Like two people had just said something out loud that didn't require sound out eventually. You looked up, and so did he, and you saw it. The softness, the silent question still lingering in the space between his ribs and his mouth. The vulnerability that came with being allowed to want something you hadn't earned. The way he watched your face, not with hunger, but with awe. Like he was afraid if he blinked, the moment would vanish. You smiled then. Not wide, not dramatic. Just enough to say, it's okay. I'm here too, He shifted in his seat, turning slightly toward you now, his knee brushing yours fully, comfortably. The heat between you rose like something unseen and slow, not urgent but certain. You both leaned in, just slightly, Not enough for a kiss. Not yet, but enough that your shoulders aligned, that your breath matched, that if a breeze passed through the room, it would have to pass through both of you now as one. And in that stillness, you whispered something. You don't remember exactly what it was. Something about not knowing how long the delay would last. Something half playful, half true. But the words themselves didn't matter. What mattered was the way you said them, with your mouth closer to his now, your voice laced with the beginning of surrender. He chuckled, low and warm. At this point, he said, I'm not sure I care if the flight ever leaves. And you believed him because you didn't either. Time had gone soft around the edges. The announcements had stopped registering. The staff were quieter now, moving like shadows across polished floors. The lounge lighting had dimmed to a hush, like the night itself had lowered its voice in reverence of what was happening here. Your fingers wove together slowly, naturally, no hesitation. His hand fit around yours like it had been waiting for something to hold. And as the minutes passed, you found yourself tracing soft circles against the back of his hand with your thumb. Absent-minded, but deeply intentional. Like you were mapping the story of him in touch, learning him one curve at a time, and still, you didn't kiss because the moment was enough, because sometimes the touch of a hand says more than a mouth ever could, because you were both unraveling in the quietest, safest way. He asked you then, when was the last time you felt the scene? You wanted to lie. You wanted to say something light or clever or guarded, but the truth fell out of you like a sigh. Maybe never. His fingers squeezed yours gently, and he said, me too. You rested your head back against the lounge chair then, eyes still, on his hand still clasped, and let yourself breathe. Really breathe. The kind of breath that only comes when you've been holding tension you didn't realize you were carrying, and for the first time in weeks or months or maybe longer, then you want to admit you felt okay, not fixed, not healed, but safe, with someone whose name you barely knew, with someone whose hand told you more than words ever had. It was written on the windows, not in fog or condensation, but in the way the airport lights reflected across the glass, in the way they made your silhouettes glow faintly against the night beyond. You sat side by side, hands still gently joined, the rest of the lounge quieted into an afterthought. A distant murmur of wheels on tile, occasional overhead announcements you barely registered anymore. It all felt far away, because everything important was right here, between the two of you. No one had said a word in minutes. But the silence wasn't empty. It was rich with unspoken knowing. The kind of knowing that doesn't demand explanation, that doesn't rush to be acknowledged or framed in sentences. It just is. Like the fact that the earth spins, or the way the ocean knows when to return to the shore. Your hands were still twined, not tightly, but deliberately. He was tracing your knuckles slowly with his thumb, and you were letting him. There was no urgency in the touch, just presence. as if you'd both finally stopped trying to move through time and were instead choosing to rest inside it. You didn't speak because you didn't have to. There are moments when language feels like an interruption. This was one of them. You felt full, not in the way people talk about being in love, but in a deeper, quieter sense. Like you'd been walking around with some part of yourself unacknowledged, and now it was finally being seen, understood, held without demand. And somehow that was enough. Still, part of you wanted to say something, to break the silence just enough to let him know this matters. But as you turned toward him, ready to speak, he looked at you with an expression so open, so unguarded, that the words dissolved before you could form them. Because he already knew, and you knew, the air between. You shimmered with it. It wasn't love. Not the kind you plan for or protect. Not the kind you pack into future plans and long conversations about where this might go. This was something else. A recognition, a resonance. As if you'd both accidentally tuned your hearts to the same quiet frequency, and now neither of you wanted to change the station. He spoke first, barely above a whisper. It's strange, isn't it? You turned your head slightly, your hair brushing your cheek, your gaze still soft. What is? He smiled, slow and quiet. How this all feels more real than things I've worked years to build. You nodded. I know. It's like I've had entire relationships that didn't feel this awake. He exhaled, the sound laced with something between wonder and grief. And we haven't even kissed yet. You smiled, but you didn't laugh because he was right. And the truth of it sat between you like a warm stone. The feeling wasn't unfamiliar. You'd been on the edge of connection before, but never like this. Never so still, so quiet, so profoundly mutual. There was no chase here, no roles to play. Just two people who had happened to find each other in a place meant for waiting. And instead of waiting, you were here. You wondered for a flickering second what would happen if you asked him to stay. Not just tonight, but longer, days, weeks, if you built something off this strange and beautiful beginning. But then you pushed the thought away, not because it scared you, but because it wasn't the point. The point was this moment, not what came after. So instead, you said, sometimes I think the heart recognizes people before the mind does. He looked down at your hand in his. That I think mine recognized you the second you sat down. The moment could have broken under the weight of those words, but it didn't. It deepened. You looked at him now fully, at the quiet line of his jaw, the slight crease between his eyebrows, the softness that lived in the corners of his mouth. You thought, I'll remember this face for the rest of my life. And not because it was perfect, but because it was real. There was still so much you didn't know about him. His middle name, his favorite childhood book, the color of the sheets on his bed. You didn't know what his apartment smelled like, or if he preferred morning or night, or what song he played when he couldn't sleep. And yet, you knew the important things. You knew the rhythm of his silence, the way he held space. The fact that he was gentle in a world that often teaches men not to be, and that somehow was enough. He reached up then, slowly, and tucked a strand of hair behind your ear. His fingers brushed your skin so lightly you almost shivered. And when he didn't pull his hand away, you leaned into it just a little, letting your cheek meet his palm. Your eyes fluttered closed, and that, too, was knowing. He didn't lean in to kiss you, not yet, because this exact moment was already everything. You opened your eyes, and he was still there, watching you as if you were made of something rare. Something not to be rushed or claimed, but studied like art, like weather, like meaning. He whispered, "I don't know what happens after this." You nodded. Me neither. That you both knew, even if you never saw each other again, even if the night ended without lips meeting, even if the delay ended and time resumed its old rhythm, you would carry this dot not as regret, but as proof that somewhere, somehow, for one quiet night in a half-lit room full of strangers and announcements, you were seen, you were chosen not for your story or your plans or your promise, but simply for being their dot exactly as you were. You don't remember who moved first, only that one of you breathed in and the other breathed out, and somehow that was enough. There wasn't a sudden lunge, no cinematic pull like the ones in old movies where desire overtakes logic. This wasn't that kind of kiss. It didn't come to conquer. It came to confirm. You had already kissed each other in every way that mattered. In the way your knees had rested together like they belonged. In the warmth of his hand around yours. Fingers gently tangled as if he was holding a fragile thing he didn't want to break. In the quiet that had wrapped itself around you both like a soft shawl. In all the ways you had already said, "I see you. I want you. I don't need to own you to feel close," but the moment did come, not loud, not burning. It unfolded like the softest yes. He was looking at you the way he had all night, not with hunger, but reverence. Like you were something rare, not to be consumed, but to be understood. And when his gaze flicked to your mouth again, slower this time, more certain, you didn't look away. You didn't speak. You didn't need to, because the space between you had grown impossibly small. And when the kiss came, it was almost shy at first, a question, not a claim. His lips barely brushed yours, so softly you wondered for a moment if you'd imagined it. But then it deepened only slightly, like the tide inching forward on the sand, and it was real. Warm, sure, tender. You inhaled against him, surprised not by the kiss itself, but by how easily your body answered it. Like it had been waiting. Like this moment had been slowly building, not just tonight, but in all the lonely hours that came before. The kiss felt like punctuation, not a beginning or an end, but the mark you make when a sentence has already said what it needed to. His hand, still holding yours, tightened just enough to remind you he was real. The other had found your cheek, thumb brushing the soft curve beneath your eye, anchoring you. The kiss didn't rush. It didn't beg. It just was slow, searching, full of breath and restraint and something else too, something neither of you had named yet. You kissed like people who weren't afraid of silence anymore. When you pulled back, it wasn't because the kiss had ended. It was because you needed to look at him to see him. You rested your forehead against his, eyes still closed, and for a moment, everything felt weightless. Like you weren't in an airport at all, but suspended somewhere else timeless, placeless, untouched by whatever waited outside the glass walls. You whispered something then, a barely there breath against his skin. Maybe his name, maybe just a sound. He answered with a soft kiss to your cheek, then your temple. You felt the way he lingered there, letting the quiet stretch, not breaking it with words or movement, just being. When you looked at each other again, you both smiled, not with surprise, but with recognition. Like something had clicked into place, gently but irrevocably. Not now we're together, not this means something huge, just yes. A simple, powerful yes. The kiss had changed things, but only in the way a deep breath changes the shape of a chest. You were still the same people, still strangers, in many ways, but something had opened quietly, permanently. You leaned back in your seat, your head tilting toward his shoulder. He welcomed it immediately, turning slightly to rest against you, his hand still clasping yours. You felt the way his thumb moved absent-mindedly across your skin, and in that small rhythm, you sensed something new forming, not a future, not a promise, just a closeness, real, whole, present. Neither of you said much after that. There wasn't much left to say. You'd spent hours in conversation, winding through the corners of each other's lives, letting truths slip out that neither of you had planned to share. And now that your mouths had found each other, it was as if your bodies were finishing the sentence your hearts had started. The lounge had grown quieter still. The hour late enough now that the crowd had thinned. Only a few scattered travelers remained, some sleeping, some staring into screens or slumped over books. The world had dulled its edges, and in the center of it all, you sat with a stranger who didn't feel strange anymore. You wondered how this would look from the outside. Two people leaning into each other in matching chairs, faces soft, breathing. Slow, hands joined like something holy. No loud passion. No drama, just stillness. Just ease. If anyone was watching, they'd never guess how much had just happened. They'd never know that the kiss had rewritten the room. He turned to you again, then kissed you one more time, this one softer, surer, like a gentle exhale. And when he pulled away, he smiled like someone who knew the answer to a question he hadn't dared ask until now. You returned at dot, and for the first time in a long time, you weren't waiting for the other shoe to drop. You weren't doing the math on what would come next. You weren't measuring distance or wondering about return flights or phone numbers. You were just here, kissed, changed dot and small, sacred quiet of that moment. You knew it wasn't about what this would become, it was about what it already was. You didn't notice the announcement right away. You were still inside the quiet glow of what had just passed between you, still holding his hand like it had become a natural extension of your own, as if you'd been doing it for years, not hours. There was something about the silence after a kiss, when nothing needs to be said, when your breath still remembers the softness of his lips, the steadiness of his presence. You hadn't let go. You hadn't moved. It was as if the lounge itself had slowed to honor the stillness between you. Then the voice overhead cracked through the hush, not loud, not jarring, but clear. A gate change for your flight, a new number, a new corridor, a gentle tug back toward the real world. You both heard it. You looked at him, and something passed between you again. Not regret, not panic, but awareness of time, of gravity, of the fact that as much as this moment had felt suspended in air, you were still tethered to a journey. And so was he. The spell didn't break. It softened, became something you could fold and put in your pocket. You glanced. At the time, a few more minutes maybe, enough to not rush, enough to gather yourselves without letting go of what had just unfolded. He smiled, the same way he had when you first made eye contact across the lounge. But there was something different in it now, like he'd seen something sacred and was carrying the quiet weight of that. Looks like we'll be walking, he said. You nodded. Eventually, you didn't move. Not yet. Neither of you wanted to be the first to stand, to signal the end of whatever this was. Because it wasn't over, not emotionally, not energetically. You could already feel how this stranger had marked something inside you, how his presence had slipped between the cracks you didn't know were still open, not to fix anything, just to sit there, warm and calm and real. When you finally rose, your hands stayed linked until they couldn't be. When you each gathered your bags, his slung carelessly over one shoulder, yours clutched a little too tightly. It felt like dressing after a swim. The water still on your skin, the air different now, the world returning. You walked together through the terminal, quieter than before, but not awkward, just aware. Aware of the sound your shoes made on the polished tile, of the way his elbow almost brushed yours with every few steps, of the scent of cinnamon drifting from a closed cafe, blending with the fading trace of his cologne. I feel like I should say something important. You finally said, the corners of your mouth lifting. Just a little. He looked over, the corner of his own smile tugging back. You already did. You didn't ask what he meant. You knew. He meant your quiet, your nearness, your kiss. You're choosing to stay in the lounge instead of wandering off. All the things you hadn't said out loud, but had poured out of your body and presence and stillness, in the way your hands had rested on his like they belonged. You reached the new gate, and it was busier here, less dreamlike. The energy of people in motion, calling out boarding groups, checking screens, wrangling toddlers and tangled earbuds. You felt yourself return to the shape of a traveler. But inside, something had shifted. You weren't the woman who sat down in that lounge hours ago. You weren't waiting for a flight anymore. You had already arrived. He checked his own screen and nodded toward the gate beside yours. I think mine's just a few minutes ahead of yours. You both paused, not sure how to place the next words, not wanting to fall into the trap of forced endings. So, you said. So, he echoed, his voice soft. You could feel it coming. The moment that would ask you to let go. The parting. And even though you hadn't planned for anything beyond this night, hadn't even imagined it, might stretch this far, you still felt a quiet ache beginning to gather under your ribs. You wanted to hold it together, but part of you wanted to say, please don't walk away yet. He leaned in, forehead almost touching yours, his voice barely audible above the crowd. I'm really glad the delay happened. You smiled. Me too. Then he kissed you a second time, right there in the terminal, with announcements ringing and people bustling past and the fluorescent lights humming like distant stars. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It wasn't a plea for more. It was gratitude, a seal, a kiss that said, I'll carry you with me. You let it happen. You let it stay. And when he pulled back, you nodded once. Not goodbye. Not farewell. Just acknowledgement. You both stood there for another heartbeat. Maybe two. And then he stepped away, his fingers brushing yours as he did. You didn't watch him go. Not because it didn't matter, but because it did. And you knew if you watched him walk away, something inside you might break, might want to chase, might forget that not everything is meant to be held on to. Some moments aren't seeds, they're stars, meant only to shine once, quietly and completely, and then drift. And you standing there, changed and breathless and whole in a way you hadn't expected. We're okay. With that dot, you turned toward your gate and you smiled because you had been seen, because something had touched you without taking from you, because in a place built for waiting, you had been reminded how beautiful it is to arrive, even if only for one night. You didn't plan to end up here, wrapped in a warmth that isn't entirely yours, in a bed that smells like hotel soap in his skin, with your head rising and falling, slowly on his chest like you've always known how to breathe in rhythm with him. And maybe you have. Maybe some part of you, far beneath the surface, have been waiting for this very kind of quiet. Not the quiet of absence or avoidance, but the full, humming stillness that settles between two people who have nothing left to prove. The ceiling above you is off-white, grainy, lit dimly by the glow of a single bedside lamp you didn't bother turning off. It casts long, soft shadows that move slightly as he shifts beneath you, but even those shadows feel still, like stars trapped inside a room with no windows. You lie there, watching them flicker, feeling the weight of his arm draped loosely over your shoulder, your leg resting against his in that easy, unplanned way that speaks of a comfort not earned through time, But through truth, neither of you talks. There's no postscript, no analysis, no rushing to define what just happened or where it belongs. The night doesn't ask for labels, it only asks for presence. And so you stay inside the feeling, quietly letting it soak into your bones like warmth into chilled fingers. His hand moves now and then, fingertips tracing soft circles along your back, not searching for anything, just listening. And every time his breath deepens, your own breath follows. A silent, intimate call and response. You remember how the door closed behind you hours ago? How the hush of the hallway gave way to this cocoon of low light and cotton sheets. How he stood there looking at you like maybe he couldn't believe you were real. And you stood there with your suitcase still in your hand, unsure whether to step in fully or linger in the doorway. Like crossing into that room would mean saying yes to more than just a night. But you did cross. You set the suitcase down. You stepped out of your shoes. And when he reached for your hand again, he didn't pull. He just held it the same way he had in the lounge, as if asking, "Are you still here with me?" And you weren't making. Love wasn't rushed. It wasn't choreographed or cinematic. It didn't unfold like a story you could have written ahead of time. It was slow, tentative, beautiful in the way only first-time closeness can be when both people are paying attention. He kissed you like he already knew your breath, like he'd memorized the edge of your sighs back when your shoulders first touched. You undressed each other gently, not to discover bodies, but to honor them. And when your skin met as fully, you didn't flinch. You leaned in. You let it happen, piece by piece, the unfolding of something unnamed but deeply known. There was no performance, no pressure, just the raw truth of skin on skin, warmth meeting warmth, the kind of intimacy that doesn't demand anything but presence. You made love like two people who weren't trying to escape their lives, but simply wanted to rest from them. And afterward, when your breath slowed and the room returned to its hush, he didn't let go. He didn't roam away. He pulled you closer, pressed his lips to your shoulder, and just held you. And now here you are, still inside that afterglow, still watching the ceiling like it might offer some final message before morning comes. You don't ask what this meant. You don't need to, because the answer is all around you in the rise and fall of his chest. In the quiet way his fingers have laced into yours beneath the blanket. In the peaceful weight of your own body fully exhaled beside someone who didn't demand you earn his affection. You wonder, briefly, what this will feel like in memory. Will it soften? Will it grow brighter? The way some nights become legends simply because they happened once and never again? Or will it fade gently like mist over glass, less vivid, but still there, waiting to be traced again when the world grows too sharp? You don't know. You only know that right now, in this moment, it is real. Entirely, wholly real. He whispers. Something then, just a word, maybe your name, maybe nothing at all. And even though you don't reply, you squeeze his hand. A quiet yes, I'm still here. Outside, the city is sleeping. the airport quieting toward its slow midnight rhythm. Somewhere out there, boarding passes are printing, taxis are lining up, coffees are brewing for red-eyed travelers. But in here, the world has stopped moving. In here, time has curled in on itself, wrapped in soft linens and a stranger's heartbeat. That no longer feels strange. Eventually you'll move. The sky will lighten, the flight will call, the story will slip back into its structure, but not yet. For now, you stay where you are, lying there, watching the ceiling like stars, letting your chest rise and fall in time with someone who found you, not by accident, but by arriving exactly when you were ready to be found out, soft, timeless, and slow. A goodbye that doesn't rush to leave. Sometimes the world doesn't need to change to feel different. A city doesn't have to shift its skyline. A flight doesn't need to be canceled. And a person doesn't have to make a promise. Sometimes all it takes is one pause in the middle of a long day, a delay that wasn't part of the plan, a stranger with warm eyes, a seat beside someone you weren't meant to meet, and the kind of conversation that rearranges something inside you without ever asking for more. You might never see him again. The night may live only here, inside the folds of memory where soft moments tuck themselves away. But you'll remember the weight of his hand in yours, the hush of the terminal, the first brush of lips that didn't come to possess, only to understand. You'll remember the silence between words, the warmth of breath, the way it felt to be chosen in the quietest way possible, without conditions, without maps, without any need to explain. This wasn't a love story you told the world. It was one you kept, gentle, brief, a night that asked nothing of you but truth, a night that didn't end with forever and didn't need to, because sometimes once is enough. Once, when it's real, can echo for a lifetime. So if you ever find yourself in a terminal somewhere, tired from the day, holding a ticket to somewhere you no longer feel like going, look up. Look around. Sit beside someone without knowing their name. And if you feel it, that quiet, magnetic pull that tugs just enough to make you wonder, don't look away, because love doesn't always arrive in the big moments. Sometimes it shows up quietly, in a lounge, in a glance, in a delay, and when it does, you'll know